Perfect. So, welcome everyone. So for those that don't know us, obviously most of you are authors, which is great. But Barnthorn, we have recently started up as a publisher. So last September, we're quickly approaching our anniversary, which Neil and I can't believe how quick that's gone. We no, not just military history. A lot of our books are currently in that genre because of where our backgrounds are. Neil and I are very passionate on military history. Um, but we're also working in other areas of fiction, poetry, and other matters. So, we just launched our website. So if you have a look at www.barnformpublishing.co.uk, you can find out more about us there and how you can potentially work with us, whether that's as an author or if you sell books or want to work with us in any other kind of way. We're always open to hearing from people, and we like to use Zoom as a way of meeting new people. And even this evening, we've just been on with an author who is hopefully going to sign with us. So we're quite friendly. Well, we like to think so. So yeah, please feel free to reach out to us. So Mark, obviously probably time to introduce yourself really. What's your background?
Well, I did a history degree many years ago. Up north, I did it in Preston, University of Central Lancashire. So I did a history degree, then qualified to be a teacher. And that was over 20 years ago now. So I'm now an assistant head in a special needs school down in Worcestershire. So obviously I've always been fascinated with military history. I used to read comics and stuff like that when I was much younger. Always sort of aware of the Victoria Cross. That was always there as a bit of a, knew some of the stories, didn't know lots and lots of the stories, not as much as I know now. Then as obviously time went on, I then obviously about 10 years ago now, it's quite a long time ago now, 10 years ago, having sort of collated bits of information about the Victoria Cross. I wasn't particularly technically minded, but my wife set up a website for me, which is now Victoria Cross Online, which has quite a lot of followers around the world. And it's got a huge amount of information on there now, not just on Victoria Cross, but other gallantry awards, which I'm sort of constantly updating and chipping bits onto and changing things and things like that. And literally, it's become a bit of an obsession, really, as my wife calls it. I get a little bit crazy over it and get it done. And then obviously, probably chipping into another question, but obviously I've always thought about writing a book. People have always said to me on the online group and stuff like that on Facebook, they've said, "Oh, you should write a book." And I'm like, well, I don't think I'm that good at writing a book. I haven't got a clue what I'm doing. So, and then a while ago, I put a submission into let's just say, a different publisher who didn't think it was a goer, didn't think, there was the market for it, put me off a little bit. And then I was sort of last year, obviously saw Neil and Ashley's new venture, should we say. And I just thought, well, I'll put an idea in Neil and Ashley's pot, so to speak. And then sort of literally just by coincidence, really, when I was thinking of an idea and I was going through a few ideas on a phone call with Neil about what possibly could be a project, then suddenly I thought ahead about 8 months and thought, 80th anniversary of D-Day, what about Stan? And that's where the idea came about. And then Neil sort of said, well, if you can get it done in 6 months and get it written in 6 months, we've got a chance of getting it out for the 6th of June. So the 13th of May was pretty good to get it obviously published. So there we are.
It helped, Mark, that you've been doing all the research for years. You had the information. Because when I write books, a lot of my time it's not the actual writing, it's gathering the information. So you had a head start. So
I had a page about Stan obviously on the website, which isn't obviously anywhere near as detailed as the book.
Yeah.
But I had that. I had a bit of a picture archive, pictures that people have either sent me or ones that I've got of my own. So I had a sort of a starting point, and then it was a case of looking at what was out there as almost filling in the gaps or adding in bits that maybe weren't there before or people didn't know before, which could obviously put maybe a bit more of a unique selling point to the book, which is where I wanted to go with, really.
That makes sense. I mean, so you mentioned the Victoria Cross. That's kind of where this journey started for you.
Mm.
Was that, was that through certain stories of certain recipients, or was it particularly actions or stuff that first got your interest in the VC?
To be fair, it was like, as a, younger, obviously, like I said, I'd pick up, these comics. I mean, a lot of people would have read them, like the Commando one. And, I found a few old copies when I was younger of Victor and things like that. And obviously, Victoria Cross stories often featured in some of these magazines, or they'd be based on, they'd be a fictionalized version similar to an action. And it sort of piqued the interest and it gets you there. And then it was a case of, okay, I'd pop into like the local, military museum and then, yes, they weren't the real ones on display, but you'd go there, oh my God, this is the highest award for gallantry. You'd get interested in the stories behind it. And then actually the fascination for me isn't so much, well, it is interesting what the actual person did, but it's almost the person behind it. I know Neil's written about, and so's Kevin, about Victoria Cross recipients, but it's almost the man behind it. Once you get to know the person behind it, you try and look into the psyche of that person and you go, what made them do the things that they did? And there's lots of different answers you get, really, different, recipients who are still alive that you can ask. All the records about people will tell you different things. Some will say it was just gut instinct. It just happened like that. Some will go, I got really, really peed off, to not use any French. And it wound me up and I had to go and sort it out. Some did it for other reasons, so that's an interesting thing to me. It's what's the person like behind it and the effect it had. And that's really, with Stan, there's all of those elements in with Stan. I mean, once obviously reading into him and finding more out about him, the more I ended up thinking this guy is a great character. He is a fabulous character. It was easy to write about him because there's so many bits and facets to him which were fascinating to me. And obviously, I don't want to give any spoilers away because you've got to read the book.
Yeah, and I think something you touched on there, that some VC actions can literally be a moment. Perhaps quite an ordinary person just was in the right place at the right time and did perceivably the right thing. And with Stan, as you read the book, you get the sense that no, this wasn't a one-off. This just happened to be the day that he got recognised. He'd already, which we'll come on to in a minute. He'd already been in action elsewhere. He wasn't. He certainly wasn't gung ho, but he wasn't going to stand, hide out the way. He was always going to give a good account of himself, and he was clearly a very, very good and dedicated soldier. So, I mean, probably worth at this point just giving. I know we're not going to go into all the different nooks and crannies of the book, but do you want to just give a bit of a kind of timeline, really, as to how the book flows, what the kind of the main chapters are, etc.
Yeah, I mean, it opens up, obviously the opening chapter is Yorkshire Rebel, because it talks about his childhood, which was a childhood where he moved around a lot up in the northeast of England. His father had been in the First World War and been badly gassed. It had affected his father quite badly. His father came back. Because of his father being away for a period of time, they had to move around. They ended up starting a fish and chip shop. He ended up helping out in the fish and chip shop, which actually helped him when he was in the army because he was the best peeler of chips or potatoes ever seen, apparently. He then talks about him, it then goes into a chapter about how he then goes through the 1930s and the Great Depression. There's not a lot of work round up in the northeast. He becomes a lorry driver, gets work where he can here and there. He's tried out with the Merchant Navy because he's legged it to sea a couple of times against his father's wishes. They found him and brought him back. He's eventually got permission to join the Merchant Navy. That doesn't quite go to plan because of health reasons. And then by the sort of later part of the 30s, he decides to try, with the dark clouds coming down, he decides to join the 6th Battalion of the Green Howards. Then obviously I'm not going to go into huge amounts of detail, but he ends up pretty much in every theatre of war you can imagine. I mean, he goes through Dunkirk and escapes by the skin of his teeth. He ends up in North Africa, and as one of the stories goes, he comes across Rommel. He then ends up in Sicily, in the Sicily campaign. He's had 2 recommendations, one for the military medal and one for the DCM, which for various reasons didn't go through. Then obviously the book then goes into the background to D-Day and the preparations for D-Day, then actually what he does on D-Day. And then there's quite a bit about the aftermath, because obviously there's a bit about the Falaise pocket, because he was involved in the Battle of Falaise, which then led to the wounds that led him to be, basically, I think, saved his life, because he then didn't actually, then he got invalided out. He wasn't able to go back. So he missed the last sort of 9 months of the war, which potentially, with his luck, I think, could have possibly run out. I mean, he'd had quite a bit of luck up until this point and quite a few significant wounds. But then obviously the latter part of the book then goes into the tough times he had straight after the war. He got all these promises of great job offers, but he hated the publicity. He'd slip out of civic events, giving excuses. And then the latter part goes into, obviously there's the famous story about the longest day and, and being asked to meet a German dignitary, which he didn't really take kindly to, and was probably not a great idea. And then also there's the stuff about, which obviously wasn't really recognised then, but his own personal demons, the PTSD, which obviously did contribute to a death at the age of 59. Undoubtedly, the war wounds he suffered both physically and mentally did, I think, contribute to him not living as long a life as you would have hoped. But I think that's probably enough, Ashley. I don't want to give too much away. I think that's a pretty good presage, you think?
Yeah, I mean,
have you read the book, Ashley? So
yeah, a few times. Yeah, I think it's look, he's had a very busy period of time, hasn't he? As you say, he's been in several theatres. And how many wounds did he get? 5, was it?
5 is what most places say is 5. I mean, it's not quite clear about that. I'm staggered by the fact, when I read through all the stuff, is that you almost can read that at least twice, if not 3 times, he ends up with a metal plate in his face to reconstruct his face. For certain, we know there's the one where he was very badly beaten in the POW camp in North Africa, and he had to have a metal plate put in there because they broke his cheekbones. And we also know that the injury that he got 48 days, which he was very lucky to survive. I mean, he was in the headquarters waiting instructions, basically. His commanding officer had gone off for a meeting. He was sat there. They were sat around discussing things, waiting for the next bit, and a mortar bomb went off. The guy was killed next to him. Stan was basically discovered under a load of debris. They thought he was dead. And he got, he was deaf in one ear temporarily. He got, significant facial injuries, which led to a plate being put back in. Injuries to his left leg, which they didn't solve at the time. He had huge amounts of shrapnel and things in there, which later part of the book says what happens with the shrapnel. So he was very fortunate to survive, but he still wanted to go back. So when he was in the hospital bed and he got evacuated back to the UK, which is obviously when he finds out that he's been recommended for the VC and it's gone through, he wanted to go back. And he was told on medical advice, no, you can't. Rest up for the rest of the war, young man.
Indeed. And he, his story in Dunkirk, got that kind of time, is really fascinating. That he had a role as a dispatch rider, I believe. Was that right? It was to do with
yeah. He was a motorcycle rider. He was whizzing around all over the place. And some of my favourite bits of the book are some of the sort of, I would call them probably madcap adventures he got up to. I mean, I see one of the questions you sort of said to me, Ashley, when you gave me the list, was about favourite bits of the book, and it's more his sort of his pranks and his sort of madcap adventurous thing. So there's obviously the one in the book where literally they've got these 1,500 weight trucks, which basically they've got off the Germans, and they're now using them for themselves, and they're basically trying to get through this thing, and they've got this roadblock and these German military policemen in the way, and Stan just goes, right, oh, well, doesn't think anything of it, jumps on his motorcycle, basically rides up to the guys, and almost with no German whatsoever, he just sort of makes it look like it's the Germans are coming through, not the British, and they completely got away with it. And the people who were there with him just went, well, that's just Stan. He just thought on his feet, and he just went, he just flew out there and literally thought on his feet and got them out of there. I mean, the incident which got him the recommendation for the military medal was that some members of the Welsh Guards had got trapped, and he and 5 of the guys were basically told, you've got to create a diversion so these Welsh Guardsmen can escape at Dunkirk, to which there's not a huge amount of information about it, but by all accounts, Stan and the 5 guys did cause enough of a disruption to get these Welsh Guardsmen to safety, or comparative safety. Got them to the Dunkirk beaches anyway to get evacuated. Another favourite bit of the book is where he played the prank on his commanding officer, who had a lot of respect for Stan, a chap called Robin Hastings, who was the guy who actually put his DCM recommendation in for him, and was actually very surprised it didn't go through. Robin Hastings wrote his autobiography, and actually wrote in it that he believed that Stan had got the DCM, and was very surprised when he found out Stan hadn't got one. I think he bumped into Stan a little bit after the war and sort of thought he had a DCM. No, I didn't get one. Don't know what happened, but it never went through. And he basically plays this prank on Robin Hastings not long after D-Day, where he literally got a body of a dead German sniper, tied a telegraph wire around him, put him in a tree, telegraph wire around the guy, then tied the other end of the telegraph wire to the back of Robin Hastings' Jeep. So when the driver, Robin Hastings, then drives away, this German sniper, dead guy, comes flying out of the tree, crashes into the back of the Jeep, freaks Robin Hastings out, who turns around and goes, you devil, Hollis, knows exactly who's done it to prank him. And it's that sort of that nature to Stan that's there, and it's all the way through the book. I mean, there's bits about him, he earned his stripes, then he lost them, and then he got them back again, and it's usually because he did things like he'd nip off to go and see his wife, and when he came back, he went, oh, I'll take the punishment because it means I can stay here and do the PE stuff and get myself fitter. He wasn't that bothered. He seemed to have a slight, I wouldn't say a disdain for authority, but because he was such a damn good soldier, I think they sort of accepted some of his quirks, and how good a leader he was of men, that they went, well, we'll accept the fact that he's just tried to upset his commanding officer with a dead German sniper. There's that cheekiness to him. And of course, there's his famous quote, which I'm not going to say on the screen because it's polite company.
Yeah. Just touching
if you
on
read the book, you'll know that quote.
Yeah.
But it's his famous quote that most people know. But I'll leave it there for that one.
Yeah. But going back to his, doing a bit of PE as such, there was a bit of a situation before the war with his mother, if I recall correctly.
That's the bit. Yeah, that's the bit where he basically got a little bit. It was a little bit homesick, I suppose, but he wanted to, nip out at weekends and stuff and go home, and he'd literally just go out the window. He'd go out the window and go off and see, his mum, knowing that when he come back, he'd be in trouble with, his superiors. And then he'd go, oh God, you're going to give me that punishment again, aren't you? Which was it's nicknamed Yankers, the punishment. And he just went, oh, what does that involve? Oh, that means I've got to do extra PE duty, or I've got to go and help out in the kitchens peeling the spuds, which of course he was quite good at that. He'd done that when he was 14 in the fish and chip shop. So, the punishments they gave him wasn't that bothered. He just thought, I just want to make myself the best soldier I can be, and just push the boundaries slightly of, what's allowed and what isn't. He wasn't someone who stuck to the rules all the time.
Indeed, and I think throughout the book there's a lot of reference to other people's thoughts about Stan. You mentioned obviously the officer. There's other people being quoted around that as well. So I'm just going to feed in one of the questions I got from the audience was what
Yeah.
kind of what sources were available in terms of you've mentioned one of them, the biography of the officer.
Yeah.
But what kind of other sources were available to you?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, there's been a previous book written about Stan, which is a reference I've used. That obviously, when that book was written, which was 12 years ago or so, obviously both of Stan's children were still alive, so they were interviewed for that book. So some of their recollections are some of the bits that are in the book, which there are also bits in the book where coming across the stories and things like that. One of the useful things in the process of writing the book was obviously yourself and Neil have to look through and coming at it from the angle of going, oh, let's find out a bit more about that, or what else is there about that. So, for example, the military medal story, and which unfortunately, having looked into the records, which was done at the time back when the previous book was written, I had a look around, see what's around about it. Is obviously the story goes that it was this Sergeant Major had a bit of a gripe about Stan and his mates. And when they got back after surviving Dunkirk by the skin of their teeth, a military medal recommendation was going in. But these 6 guys, including Stan, decided to go for a pint, should we say, to celebrate the fact they were still alive. Stan always claimed it was only half a pint. They obviously arrived back at barracks, and the story goes is the Sergeant Major took it rather rudely and thought they were being drunk on duty, and he apparently then didn't pass on the paperwork. Unfortunately, despite lots of searches through the records, no military medal actual recommendation is found or still there, or reasons why it didn't go through. So that's one issue there, is it's not there. The DCM as well, that recommendation, most of the stuff about that comes from, like I said, Robin Hastings, his autobiography. He was there, he was present, he witnessed Stan's action that led to him recommending the DCM. There's quite a few. Obviously, I liaised a little bit with the Green Howards Museum and their researcher up there, a chap called Stephen Erskine, who was very helpful. And he was able to get me photos of people like Ronnie Lofthouse. And Ronnie Lofthouse was the major who literally, on Gold Beach, was the guy literally running alongside Stan for a lot of it. He witnessed a lot of what Stan did and was one of the people that helped write up the recommendation. So, and there's some of his papers that are still in the Green Howards Museum. So I was able to get snippets that Stephen sent me and said, oh, this bit will be useful and this bit will be useful. So that was very handy. Yeah, so that's sort of the main bits, really. I mean, Stan's service record, I didn't get to see that. I mean, that could have been useful, possibly, to see if there was anything on there that could have been of use. That's just me with hindsight thinking that could have been something to look at. But obviously getting a hold of his service record would be tricky, as he's not a family member, and getting used to that. So, and it's only in recent times, obviously, I'm quite fortunate, I have to say, that obviously people might have seen that his granddaughter has been pretty much everywhere. She was on the Antiques Roadshow on Sunday. She's done interviews all over the place. She knows Stan's story, and quite nicely, I'm not trying to sell myself, but she's bought a copy of the book, which she messaged me to say that she bought it at the weekend. So, and so far her feedback's been quite positive, because I was quite nervous about the fact, because granddaughter reading the book is, she told the story on the Antiques Roadshow of being when she was in the pub with Stan when he was a pub landlord, and she remembers his large hands and some of the stuff he went through, the PTSD. She remembers some of that as a child. But her first feedback was she'd read the first 3 or 4 chapters and she found out stuff about Stan and his childhood that she didn't know. So I took that as a compliment.
No, that's good. I'm going to
Yeah.
fit in another question that we've had just to cover that off, and then I've got one that's in my head as well. Um,
Okay.
so going back to when he was told he couldn't go back to the fighting
Yeah.
towards the end of the war. Do you think that he'd push that as far as he could? That he'd obviously appealed it in some way. But it was like a definite no. The question was basically poised that could he have insisted that he be allowed to return? But I think perhaps with his record, maybe that was
It's tricky. It's tricky to say because I think the evidence about it is anecdotal. I know. I mean, I came across this in more recent times. I know, and I know a few bits have been played over the last few days of where there's Stan talking, actually hearing his voice talking about various things he did. Um, I think the character he is, and having written about him now, and obviously got more of an understanding of him, I think he wouldn't have taken it lying down, to say the least, about the decision. I think he would have vocalized his opinion in quite a forthright way. But I think possibly maybe his wife might have had an influence. He'd been away from home for a long period of time. She'd probably seen, when he was back at times, she'd have seen the impact on him already, the physical scars that were already building up from previous injuries and wounds and things. I don't know how much he would have fought it. I think he would have, definitely complained, and maybe sought to see if there's any channels that could mean that he could get back. But I think in the end, I think he gave in to the medical advice that was there that, this is, you are basically being patched up here because the injuries were significant on the last one. The leg injuries, the partial deafness in the left ear. There was definitely elements there that would have said, no, probably you can't go back on those grounds. But I think he'd have fought it, definitely.
Yeah, yeah, and I think as a VC holder, then he was obviously he'd done his bit, hadn't he? He'd been
Yeah,
throughout the war.
but there's also actually with some of the VC holders, obviously after they were awarded the VC, sometimes the powers that be tried to protect them. A famous example would be Guy Gibson from the Dam Busters raid, who after obviously the Dam Busters raid, they tried to put him almost into being a PR, go round, doing PR sort of stuff, and also they tried to take him away from the firing line, so to speak. They and in the end, he sort of got himself, he persuaded the powers that be that he wanted to do his bit and go back, and then died in what was it was in circuit. It wasn't really in a combat situation. So potentially, would that be in the case with Stan? If he hadn't have done it, would he have gone back? I think he'd have actually gone. If I'm fit enough, I need to be back with my mates. I think that's what we would have done. But there are, like I said, Guy Gibson's a good example of where they've tried to sort of almost say with the VC guy, oh, this guy is very famous now. Gibson was very famous. That let's not put him back in the firing line. There's other things he could do, but then they insist, well, that's not fair on everybody else. Just because I've got the post nominal of VC after my name, and in Gibson's case, he got several other post nominals as well. But to go back. So yeah, and I've just seen Andrew's comment come up on the thing there. I'd agree with that Gibson also was suffering from PTSD in some way, so his judgment may have been impaired. I would agree with that.
One thing there that just sort of relates into this, when you said they tried to sort of usher these people, these VC recipients who are now on a pedestal, although half of them, or majority of them, didn't really want to be on a pedestal. They were, and they were taken off the front line, like you say, or taken out of dangerous, roles. Todger Jones, I did the book on him. He was given a role at HQ, sort of Batman sort of role. He was infantry. He was a private. He was in the thick of all the fighting. They took him out of that until there was a battle, and he then, through casualties of the runners, he volunteered for that. He ran to the front line, started fighting, rallied some men, attacked the town, and got a DCM. They couldn't contain him, but they tried to. But yeah, so it's exactly the same sort of thing. You know, they him off the front to look after him. But the first chance he got, he was back earning medals again.
Yeah, which tells you something about his character.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So just going back to D-Day itself, obviously appropriate 80 years ago today, as we all know. So you've obviously walked the ground of Hollis's actions previously. I can't remember when it was you'd gone, but you've walked the ground. You've followed his kind of journey, you know, from the beach up to the pillbox. Do you want to say anything around that? How you found?
Yeah,
that?
I mean, I did that with somebody who's on this call. I did it with Kevin. So if I get any of this wrong, Kevin will probably chip in. Yeah, so we did it back in 2018. So we obviously started at the hut, the famous Stan Hollis hut, as it is, or tram shelter, bus shelter, it's sometimes called, concrete construction that Stan took to be a pillbox, but just opened fire on it, the first bit of the VC action in sense. Yeah, and then obviously we followed the road up. We didn't actually manage to find the Mount Fleury battery because the field was pretty overgrown. Probably it was probably the best way to put it. I mean, if you saw the Antiques Roadshow on Sunday, obviously Fiona Bruce walked up to the Mount Fleury battery, and obviously it's just the slit of the pillbox, and there's quite a lot of vegetation and stuff around it, so it's quite low to the ground. So obviously, when me and Kevin did that, we sort of wandered up and we knew we were in the right sort of area, didn't quite see it. But we were able to sort of, you know, walking it up. Then we sort of carried on up and we ended up obviously in the village of, you know, Crepon, which is where the Green Howards Memorial is now. Obviously the statue there isn't Stan, but it's sort of modelled on a generalisation of a Green Howard soldier. And some people believe it's, you know, there's obviously going to be an element of Stan in it, but they wanted to recognise the whole of the regiment, not just Stan, for the actions on Gold Beach that day. So yeah, so I have, you know, so I've seen the ground. Obviously, for the book, I got some colleagues obviously sent me some images of some of the other bits, you know, of the story, like the rhubarb patch, the orchard bit of the story, which is the third bit where he goes back having, well, story goes is that, depends on which bit you read, it's almost like he either forgets about the two guys and then goes, oops, I need to go back and get them, or they do actually, as a group, get pinned under heavy machine gun fire, and these two guys carrying Bren guns get trapped in the orchard near the rhubarb patch, and Stan then goes, well, I took them in there, I need to go and get them out, is his quote to his commanding officer. And of course he then goes dashing back in there, finds the two guys. They're not keen to move, to be fair. And in his own certain way, he tells them, right, get off your backsides if you want to get out of here. And then he gets them out of there. So there is that bit. So yeah, so we did walk a good chunk of following his path and his footsteps, which is very useful because it obviously helps you think back to, you know, when you're writing about it, you can almost picture it going, right, yeah, remember that day going up that path, up that hillside, you know, the bit by the hut where he dives down almost like in a temporary sort of, puts his Bren gun down to open fire on what turns out to be an empty concrete construction. But it's the start of the story. And it's almost one of the most emotive bits of the story, actually, opening fire on this empty tram shelter, bus shelter, which is now owned by the Green Howards, of course. They bought the hut back in 2006. So
yeah, it's good. It's good that it's you know, it's still there. It's somewhere that people can visit and connect with the story and do that kind of journey you described. And obviously,
yeah, I mean, yeah, the man who actually bought it was also the man who, back in 1982, bought Stan's medals, which is why they're in the Green Howards Museum now. The same chap, obviously, has been a bit of a benefit. He's no longer around, but he was a big benefactor of the regiment. So he was the one that eventually, when Stan's widow took the decision to sell the medals, he basically said straight away, well, I think Stan's wishes would have been that they came to the Green Howards. And basically then that was all sorted. And then in 2006, when this bit of the story, the tram shelter, whatever you want to believe, the hut, became sort of like, it was becoming a bit run down, and everybody visited it, basically decided, let's make it the Stan Hollis hut, or the Stan Hollis VC hut. And then obviously there's a plaque on the side of it to explain that bit of the story and what Stan did. And it's one of the most photographed bits of Stan's story now, is the hut.
And he's also commemorated in the UK. So, I mean, something that features in the book is the recent kind of refurbishment of his grave. Do you want to just comment on that?
Yeah. That was obviously something that came about through links I've got. Obviously, the Victoria Cross Trust do a lot of work around the country. Obviously, trying to remember the recipients of the VC, especially some of the ones where the graves have become, either lost or they're in a poor state of repair. Obviously, they then decided, early in the year, well, with the anniversary coming up, let's go and have a look at Stan's grave. So they went to have a look at it. Now, Stan's grave was actually in a lot better condition than a number of VC graves around the country, but it was showing signs of some cracks, which could be, with weather, could end up getting worse. And obviously, it would be nice for the anniversary if it looked splendid, as in it looked, better than it did. So obviously, I thought that was very useful. I got contacted by the chairman of the VCT, Keith Lumley, who said, it might be a nice bit for the book if you could hang fire and you could put a postscript in about the renovation of the grave. And so I was quite happy to do that. So that became the postscript of the book. It makes it very up to date that his grave has now had a good clean, it's been repaired. It made it look very good for the commemoration today, because there was a service there today at Acklam Cemetery. And I know the granddaughter was involved in giving the permission for that to be done at the grave. There's also his statue that went in, which is outside Dorman Museum in Middlesbrough, which was put in 2016, which also has all the other Green Howards VCs are mentioned on plaques all the way around it, but it's a round Stan statue in the middle. So, and obviously his granddaughter was there for that, and actually his son Brian was still alive at the time of that, so he attended that when that was unveiled as well. So yeah, there are memorials to Stan still in the UK, and obviously, of course, his medals are in the Green Howards Museum, so which is another memorial to him that the medals are there.
Indeed. And going back, obviously we've gone to one end of the book, so we might as well go back to the front of the book. What about the foreword?
Yes. Well, obviously I'm sort of fortunate, because I've had the fortune of only once, but I've met Keith Payne. I know Kevin's met him a few times, but I met Keith back in 2016. I met him at the Union Jack Club. And actually, when I first joined up with Barnthorne, the picture I actually sent piqued Ashley and Neil's interest, I know, because I was holding a very large medal group in my hands, which actually was it's a replica set. It's obviously Keith's sort of then, I mean, his medal group is now a little bit longer. Yeah, so I had the pleasure of meeting Keith at the Union Jack Club. Great memory of him, because I walked in, you don't know what to expect. He was then sort of 83 then, he's now 91, nearly 91. So I walked in, the first thing I walked over, I sort of thought, I'll go over and I'll say, hello, sir, pleasure to meet you, in the company of a legend. The first thing he said, mine's a red wine, please, before he said anything else. So I had to head to the bar first, get him a large glass of red, then came back, to which he then said to me, I'm not going to tell you anything about my VC action, because it's everywhere. You can read it anywhere to find out what I did. And he told me a very random story about a platypus, which I won't share with you now, but was quite entertaining, involving a duck-billed platypus and his finger. You can ask me if you want later, and I'll tell you the story. And And then, so obviously from then, and then some of the contacts I've got in the VC group, obviously Keith does a lot down in Australia for veterans. He's very passionate about veterans, Australian veterans in particular, who've come back with PTSD from Vietnam and other conflicts. So he's got a veterans group down there. It's one of the reasons he's got some of the other medals that he's got. He's got an Australian Order of Merit and things like that because of his work with veterans. So someone I know on the group works with Keith because Keith is nearly 91 now, so runs it for him. So I thought, well, through there, I'd ask Keith if he'd be happy to write the foreword for the book, which obviously he said he very much be very happy to do and was honoured to do. He obviously reappraised himself with the citation because, you know, Keith's had the pleasure of obviously meeting a huge amount of VCs in his time. He's come over from the Australia numerous times for the reunions. So he knows, he's met and knows ones who are no longer with us. Obviously, one thing he did say was, of course, he never had the pleasure of meeting Stan because Keith obviously was awarded his VC in 19. He was invested with it in 1970. By the time he came over for the first VC reunion, GC reunion, was 72 when that was the year Stan died. So he said he never got the chance to meet Stan, and he says that in the foreword. But by reading the citation, finding out a bit more about Stan, he saw similar elements between himself and Stan. Some of the things that Stan did and some of the stuff about leadership of men. And if anybody's had the pleasure of reading Keith's recent biography, it's called No One Left Behind. And that's Keith's mantra. Was obviously the action he did was there were 40 guys trapped in the jungle, either wounded, some dead, you know, some struggling to get out of there. And Keith said, well, I'm their command, you know, I'm their leader. I need to go back and get them off there, get them out of there. And he saw elements of that with Stan's citation and said, well, I can see myself in him. And said, well, you know, and said that, you know, it would have been fascinating to talk to him if he'd have been alive for me to meet him. So I was very honoured that Keith agreed to do it. And hopefully, I've already seen an image of him with the book because I sent a copy out there to show him. So I might share that at some point. And I know Ashley and Neil want to share that as well. Because I know Keith also did a foreword for one of Kevin's previous books as well. So that was really good. That was really good.
Perfect. So you mentioned other books then. So have you got any plans to pen something else? Anything that's in mind?
Not concrete yet. I mean, you know, obviously the VCs is my thing, really. I know me and Neil had a bit of a conversation, a bit of a toyed with a few ideas. And as Neil will say, the issue is, and it's not me denigrating anybody with the VC, is obviously some VCs have had several books written about them. They're more in the public eye. Some people have heard of them. You know, Neil wrote obviously his recent book on Hook. Now, a lot of people, even who aren't really in the military, may have heard of Hook, you know, with the Zulu film and everything else. And I know Neil dispelled all the myths for us. But there's other VCs that people will go, yeah, I've heard of him, I've heard of him, I've heard of him. But then there's some that haven't got a book about them. But then when you look into those guys, and it's not denigrating them at all for what they did, because what they did was significant, but there's very little written about them. Or if you delved into it and tried to find out a bit more of their background, you know, because that's what you want to write about. You want to write about the man behind it. You find, oh, there isn't enough there. So does it make a book? Then obviously, if I came to yourself, Ashley or Neil, and said, oh, I want to write about this guy, and you guys go, oh, well, how famous is this guy? Are people going to know him? Are people going to buy this guy's story? I know that sounds really bad and a bit harsh, but that is unfortunately the case with some of them. It's like, you know, you've got to find that sort of point. Obviously, Stan has got the ultimate because he's the only VC on D-Day. So he's got that as almost a tagline to him. It's a bit like if you wanted to write a book about people like Charlie Upham or Arthur Martin Leake, Noel Shavas, which there are books about them because they're the three VC and bars. But people have already written books about them, and there's lots known about those three individuals. So yeah, I mean, later this year you've got Arnhem, which I know Neil's written a book about Arnhem, about Digby. But obviously there's the 5 Arnhem VCs, which I don't think there's a book about any of the 5 of them. But it's whether there's enough there to write any more detail on them. So I've got a few ideas. I mean, there's one guy that does fascinate me, and he's the youngest VC of World War II, a young lad called Dennis Donini. There was an 18-year-old lad, son of Italian immigrants, who his father was basically interned. His father ran an, here you go, there's a link with well, not quite a link, but his father ran an ice cream shop and basically got put in an Italian internment camp during World War II. And Dennis joined up and unfortunately was killed in action, in his action that got him the VC. So I'd like to look into him a bit more because he's the youngest. He was only 18. But then the fact he was only 18, you haven't got a lot to go on because he didn't live past it. But I want to look into him a little bit more because his story is something that's resonated with me. But nothing concrete as of yet. But I'm sure, I mean, Neil posed an idea to me, but I'm not sure about that one yet, Neil.
I think obviously present company accepted, several authors of VC related books. There's clearly a huge interest in the Victoria Cross, and as you say, it's you can read the citation online. You can kind of get the kind of the headline part of it, but I think that's the desire for further understanding about the people. Were these ordinary people that could you, if I was, if Russia knock on the door tomorrow, could we go and do the same things that these guys did or similar? And I think that's one of the things people have this, human question, and they're trying to understand. Oh, okay, right, this guy, he was brought up working in a fish and chip shop. He become a lorry driver. He then went and did his bit. He sounds like quite a normal guy, did normal things, and on this day he stood out. The only VC on D-Day, and that's why he's obviously so well known. But people could probably tell you, oh yeah, he got the VC on D-Day, but they wouldn't know the stuff that comes up in the book. So I think that's a nice kind of headline to leave that on and say, well, if you want to find more, get the book. So where to get the book? Obviously, you can go onto our website and purchase an unsigned copy directly from us. That supports us as a publisher. You can go on Amazon and also get an unsigned copy, and that supports Amazon and then partly us and partly Mark. Or if you want to get the signed copy, you can go to Mark's website. Don't be put off. You might find yourself looking at cakes. That's totally normal. It's Mark's partner's website that she's hosting it on. So if you want to buy some cakes as well, please do that. The book, a signed copy of the book can be found on there. So either way, join those that have already bought it. And I think with that, we'll go to any final questions. And yeah, thank you all for tuning in. I'm going to stop the recording at this point as well. So yeah, enjoy watching it back.